When I started looking at the readings of today and trying to understand how they relate to the notion of return of the prodigal son, these are some excerpts from the prophecies for today, right? We've read the full text, but if I can kind of just like take you guys through a few of these so I don't take too much of everybody's time. You notice that there is a certain almost harshness in what God is communicating to his people. He calls them dross, scum of a metal, really. He speaks of the priests violating the law and profaning the holy things, not distinguishing the Sabbath, really their main role. He despises the songs, the hymns, the celebrations, and he even promises to cause removal of joy out of his people, something that he always said that the joy of the Lord is your strength. He's essentially going to remove their strength out of them. And the common factor in all of these things is that if you were to read the second half of many of these verses, is that the people keep asking, what's our fault? What did we do that we deserve this? Why are you saying these bad things will happen to us? Quote unquote. So it seems to be clear from that, if we can try to understand it, is there's a certain disconnect. There's a disconnect between what God thinks of a current situation and what his people think of the same situation. They're both looking at the same thing, but they're both thinking differently. And this is where something can start connecting back to the story from the Gospel of St. Luke chapter 15, where the son, it's a very famous couple of verses, he would gladly have filled his stomach with the pods of where the swine ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, too many of my father's servants have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger. In looking at his situation, he started seeing it from a different perspective. He started seeing things differently. And that's what brings us to kind of a key word that's really the heart of these three prophecies, is the notion of realization, or the concept of realizing a situation differently, perceiving it differently, and how that works and why is that and so on. We need to understand and this is just something that I need to understand more, is that in our relationship with God, he is the creator, he relates to us, his covenant relationship is to save us, is to change us, to make us into a particular newness that he had intended in mind all along. And when we lose sense of this saving relationship, when we lose sense of that this is how we ought to relate to God, when we relate to God as a judge or a leader who has ordinances and we do them, okay, then our feasts become so and so. When we relate to God without relating to how he is saving me or not, or changing or not, okay, we risk becoming dross, and so on and so forth. We need to understand how things are from how God sees us, okay, more and less from how we may, depending on the time of the day or our mood or how we slept or how we've been living lately, may see ourselves. Many of God's prophets have actually came to this conclusion about asking God that it's very precious for them to realize, to see things from his perspective. So to my knowledge, there are two people in the Bible, in the Old Testament, who God did not attribute sin to. Okay, Joseph and Daniel. And what Daniel says, O Lord, righteousness belongs to you, but to us, shame of face. This is the man who God thinks of this way. He didn't consider himself to be perfect. He looked and carried the sin of all the people and brought it before God. Job speaks of God and says that he puts that the heavens are not pure in his sight. This is the holiness of God. And then the relatively known verse of King David, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxieties, and see if there is any wicked way in me. If there is any, it's a very dangerous verse to pray. if there is any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. He was seeking to see things from God's perspective. He wasn't content with, well, I've done this, I've done the right thing, I've done these things. He's going after a deeper realization of where he is and how God sees him and how God relates to him. So, when I try to understand what realization is in the first place, it's almost an act of becoming fully aware of something as a fact. It's not that, I think God thinks I do bad things or something along those lines. It's I realize certain facts. The prodigal son realized that his situation was relatively dire, that he needed to be saved. He realized, in a certain sense, that he realized his situation from the sense of how his father looks at him, and he responded to that. So, 3 things that we can probably look at in terms of realization, and one of them, the first one, is realizing who am I. If you notice in the story of the prodigal son, and in the story of even the first prophecy that the church put together for Evil Wednesday today, is that God speaks of his people as dross. He speaks of their inner makeup as something that has become polluted. Okay? It's an inner situation. And when the prodigal son is when we're told in Luke 15, we are told that when he came to himself, what did he think? Did he speak of the doings that he was making? No. He spoke of, how many of my father's hired servants have bread enough to spare, and I perish with hunger. In going to this deeper self, he found that he is a sought after son. He saw himself for who he was made, for who he is. Okay? It's not about the things that he has done or the things that he would do differently only. Okay, certainly he has to change a lot of his attitudes and he has to go back, and that's a way back. But what he's looking at is, we oftentimes become performance driven with God. We oftentimes become tied up or prodigal in our own performance, in our certain achievements. If I do this and this and this and this, then God will be happy with me, or he will love me, or something. And certainly certain things are required of us. But the truth is, am I God's son? Do I relate to him like a child relate to my father? Do I think of him as my father? Because I thought of my father a certain way. I listened to many leaders, I listened to many bosses, teachers, any number of other authority figures throughout my life, but I related to my father in a different way. He was all these things, and he is required and deserves all these things that others may, but in addition, he's my father. And it's that realization that kind of changes him. We run after, or the prodigal son in this case was running after particular things, but we also tend sometimes to run after a financial achievement, a certain relationship, as something there. And all of these things tend to empty us, tend to take us away. They're doings. We become trapped in this kind of doing trap. One example that's very helpful for who am I is the example of St. Peter and Judas. Both of these people did something reprehensible. They denied Christ. But in doing something bad, only one of them came back, who is St. Peter, obviously. And in his coming back, there was something, there had to be something different in his thinking process. There had to be something different than Judas. They were probably attacked with the same thoughts, with the same message that your doings are a failure. I mean, that you did and you surrendered and so on. Okay? But to St. Peter, at some point, there was a still small voice that said, "You are my son," that he was loved for who he is. Okay? It's that sonness, that child of God voice. And I can't imagine how difficult it was to go through however many days until he met met Christ on that beach breakfast, which fish for breakfast is interesting. But I mean, Judas couldn't deal with these voices and with these temptations for probably a few hours, okay, or however long, I don't know. But it was quite a bit. And he dealt with all that. There was a still small voice that said, "You are loved." When our Lord also gave him a prophecy beforehand, and he said that you will be tempted when you come back, strengthen your brethren. Okay? Tell them that even if you go there, you are still loved for who you are. Because it's certainly not his doings at that point in time. How do I come back from, it's a slide. How do I come back to this realization? I wanted to kind of put in a few, or the author really wanted to put in some practical notes throughout. It's important that it's a realization, right? So it's a war in my mind, in my heart, okay? And it's a war of understanding and believing that I am a loved child. I am a loved child of the Father. And one of the key things is to kind of get us off the performance track is that we are all like an unclean thing. And all our righteousness are like filthy rags. That's what the Bible tells us. It tells us, do not be conformed to a particular pattern of thinking, but renew my mind. What probably helped St. Peter, or what one of the meditations of one of the commentators is looking at, is he trusted in that still small voice. Probably the same still small voice that Elijah waited for in the Old Testament. Okay? They trusted that there is a particular, that if they were to come back, they will come back as sons. Okay? And they wanted that. And they negated all the other noise until they received that. That I am loved for who I am. And they related as such. It's that trust that sometimes becomes, that becomes difficult to master, and becomes difficult to kind of resist all the noise and all the other voices that call me something else, or call me a failure, or call me not a success unless, and call me any number of other things. The second realization, again from this painting, is who am I in the painting, right? If I was the younger son who came back to who am I, or am I the older son, okay, who said, I never transgressed your commandments at any time, and you have never given me a young goat that I might make merry with my friends. This is the type of resentment, the type of realization that I need to come to. What do I have? Okay. It's a particular form of lostness where I start feeling that, and again, in the prophecies you see it, where the people said, how do you love us? Why do you say you love us? Why should we believe you that you love us? Okay? You never gave me even a young goat. It's very difficult to believe that in all his time being with his father, if he asked for a goat, he wouldn't have given him that. Okay? But he's going through the motions, through the daily life. He's going through everything with God. Looks like him even in the painting. If you look at the two figures in the painting, the one on the right and the father who's kneeling over the young son, they look kind of externally similar. Okay? They look roughly the same. But the inner heart is very different. Okay? And it's that notion of the trouble with doing all the time is it empties me from the purpose of why am I doing these things? How am I doing them? Why am I doing it? Who am I obeying? What am I out for? It's those things, and realizing and keeping sense and coming back in contact with God, reconnecting again. One of the pieces of advice I got about prayer is it's not how much I pray, but it's that I connect to God in prayer. And it's in that connection that rebuilds me again, reestablishes a link or so for me. Sometimes it's that later resentment from the older son. We're left with the story, obviously unknown the ending necessarily, but sometimes it's that resentment that actually may push me to a lower transgression like the younger son, but coming back may actually be a little bit more difficult. But how do I come back from that realization? How do I get back to that realization? One of the best practices about that is a verse that I once heard a little talk about that said, when God spoke to Moses, when he was about to send him to liberate his people who've been persecuted for God knows how many years, he said to him, "What's in your hand?" And he said, "A rod, a shepherd's rod." It's really not an esteemed tool or a sophisticated tool by any description. Okay? And God used that rod to pretty much do unimaginable miracles. Okay? That you guys can go through Exodus and read about. It is not the trap of resentment, the trap of, I want this, and if I had this, I could do this, but because you didn't give me this, I can't serve this, or I can't do this, God. Or if I was a happier person, maybe I would have experienced joy, but I don't have joy because I'm not a happier person. And so on and so forth, and any number of other things. But what is it in my hand? We risk falling into the trap of the, I don't exactly know, but in the parable of the talents, the servant with the one talent who said, I heard you were really mean, so I just hid my talent. I didn't look at it. I didn't think about it. Okay, and then I thought, when you come back, here it is. Okay, and that's absolutely not what God is asking. What God is asking for is, what do I have in my hand right now? What is it that I have? The older son never looked at what he had. He was so focused on a goat or whatever else that he was focused on. Okay? He never looked at what he had in his hand. And this is what God in the parable of talents speaks of, where he says, for to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have abundance. But from him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away. Okay? If I can practice gratitude, if I can learn to practice some forms of gratitude, okay, recognizing, realizing the things that I'm given every day, moments in the day that I'm given every day. There was a priest in Egypt, Mounir Tawadrous, who used to thank God for the moments where he was humiliated. Every day. He would say, I know the verse in Arabic, pardon me if you don't understand, but I don't know it in English. خَيْرٌ لِي أَنَّكَ أَزْلَلْتَنِي كَيْ لَا أَتَكَبَّرْ. He would go through moments of his day, and even those moments, okay, he would actually recognize as opportunities, as things of God. Okay? Sometimes I go through my day and I can barely remember even 2 significant moments. If I can. But it's not a thing to go through as a blind film. It's something to actually experience, to go through life meaningfully, and to realize those moments and those things that were given as with gratitude. And to thank and to understand what was there a purpose, was there an intent here and there and so on. And life becomes so much richer, and my current talents possibly will increase as well. The last invite for realization is, well, you guys are going to miss that part of the slide, but the last part of the realization is, what am I called for? Reminded me of when the horrific events of Sunday happened in Egypt, and Abuna was giving a quick talk after one of the Gospels. He said, let's not lose sight of what we are called for. They're horrific events in themselves, but Christ was never vague about the invitation that he gave us. He was very, very clear. Okay. What am I called for? Am I called to building a kingdom here? Am I called to experience the kingdom of heaven here? These are 2 very different things. The older son, lost sight of actually both of them really, lost sight of what they were called for. What did their sonship mean? And it's that notion that we need to embrace, and we need to understand, what are we called for? Even when he repents, when the son repents, he says, how many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? His repentance, to a certain extent, at that moment, okay, was relatively self-serving. It was for survival. He really had no other option. He dies or he goes back to the Father. Okay? I'm glad that he chose the first option. We need to kind of, as the son goes back, he prepares all these speeches. Okay, all these, I'm going to tell him I'm not worthy to be your servant and so on. One thing you notice when you go through the actual gospel, okay, is that the father never allowed him to say the bit about, I'm not worthy to be your servant. I'm not worthy. After I'm not worthy to be your son, he never said, make me as one of your hired servants. That part, the father cut him off. He hugged him, cut him off. Because the moment we come back to God in a true repentance, he is saving him already. He's changing him already at that moment. To change from this kind of whole like a servant thing. A servant still has an option of rebelling, of complaining about his wages, of complaining about his situation. Okay, he's a servant. Okay, a son doesn't do that. A son is surrendered to his father. When in the Gospel of St. John, when Christ speaks to Nicodemus, he tells him, unless you are born again, okay, you will not enter the kingdom. You cannot enter the kingdom unless you're born again as a child. And he later on speaks about children. In his book, The Confessions, St. Augustine looks at children in general and says he has a particular negative opinion of the noise and so on that toddlers and children make. But he refers to one particular thing where he says that the key benefit of children, or the key advantage of being a child, is their total dependence and surrender to God. Okay, is that they are totally dependent on him regardless. They know even if I do this or that, or I screw up here or there, my father is there. There is a sense of surrender, and that's what we see when the prodigal son comes back. He says, when he comes back, he is given, but the father said to his servants, bring out the best robe, put it on him, and a ring on his hand, and sandals on his feet, and he surrenders to that. He now surrenders to being dressed a certain way. Maybe he didn't like the robe. Maybe no sandals. Maybe before he made different choices. But he is surrendered now in a certain metaphor to the will of the Father. He becomes a child again. The term actually, and Abuna can double check me on that, but the term that's actually used in this gospel to say my son, the word in Greek teknon, okay, actually means my child. He's using that term of children, this notion of surrender, of dependency. And so if the two ways to becoming who am I, okay, is to come back in trust. If the notion of gratitude helps me with realizing what I have, then the third one is yielding or surrendering. That actually brings me back to the Father. That brings me back to a life-saving relationship with Him. Oftentimes, the people of Israel in the Old Testament are called stiff-necked. It's one translation I know of. Okay, they don't yield. They don't surrender. They have their own, I do it this way. One issue with us humans, and I quote the author in this case, one issue with us humans is that God calls us to be beloved children, new person, but we keep insisting on some independence, on some hired servant independence that we want to kind of have on the side. And it's probably one of the more difficult things that come to us, not very natural to come to us, is the notion of surrendering and yielding. And it's a lifelong journey going on. The last thing is we're invited by one prodigal son who left his kingdom, left his father, gave up everything, came here and was crucified, suffered ultimate horrible return journey so he can bring us back with him. One of the commentators looked at it and saw that Jesus is the one way, the ultimate prodigal son, that through him and through his grace, we may actually have an opportunity to come back into the Father, into the Father's bosom.